Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is Pastor Jeff Short. Glad to have you along for the journey today. Today we're going to be looking at my old alma mater, my undergraduate alma mater, my college, Wheaton College, Illinois. And unfortunately, sadly, Wheaton College, Illinois has gone woke. And if you don't know what that means, it means that they have jumped onto the SJW train, the so-called social justice warrior train. And so now everything coming out of Wheaton College in Illinois is this social justice, leftist, democratic talking points concerning race, concerning white supremacy, systemic racism, diversity, multiculturalism, the whole thing that you see on the secular colleges across the country and universities across the countries, especially state universities. You're seeing now from private Christian college, Wheaton College. And just another example of this is the most recent Wheaton magazine. I get this to my home because I am a graduate of Wheaton College. I get this every month or every other month, depending on when they put it out. And you can see this is an edition that is talking about social distancing. The chairs are spaced, supposed to be socially distanced. And this is the Wheaton Magazine, Volume 23, Issue 3, Autumn 2020. So this is the most recent issue of Wheaton Magazine. And this is sent out to all the alumni. Now, what is so disturbing is that Wheaton College is a distinctively Christian college. And when I went to Wheaton College, there was a understanding that the college would be training and teaching young people according to a Christian biblical worldview. That was the big emphasis back then, Christian biblical worldview. So when you sent your child, your high school student, to Wheaton College, you would get a top-rate education, but more importantly, you would get a Christian biblical education. The presuppositions, assumptions, and thinking would all be coming from the revelation of God found in the Bible. That apparently is not the case now in the modern times, because we see that the college has gone totally what we call woke. And we can see this right off the bat from the college president's, Philip Rankin, his article called A Redemptive Response to the Coronavirus Crisis. And he writes in only the second paragraph, for example, he says that we continue to worry about communities across the country and around the world where the burdens of the pandemic fall disproportionately hard. Only one of many injustices during a year when we have also witnessed appalling violence against people of color. So what is he talking about? Well, anyone who's been following the news during the last 6-7 months during the pandemic lockdown is familiar with the rioting and the looting and the marching and the protesting for the so-called racial justice, equality, marching, protesting, looting, vandalism against so-called systemic racism, so-called white supremacy, so-called police brutality. There is so much going on, and the mainstream media is feeding this whole narrative to the American people. And so is most of academia, so are most colleges and universities. They've been woke many, many years ago, but Wheaton College is sort of catching up to speed, it looks like, and they're buying into all of the assumptions. For example, it says that the pandemic falls disproportionately hard, only one of many injustices. So, in other words, they're talking about supposed injustice about the pandemic. They're saying that the pandemic and COVID-19 are hitting communities of color, particularly hard, and that this is a result of social injustice or racism or systemic racism, and they're blaming the COVID-19 deaths and hospitalizations and sicknesses on justice issues, which is totally insane. The virus doesn't pick on minorities. The virus doesn't pick on members of the Black community, Hispanic community, Asian community. It doesn't pick on members of the LGBTQ community. The virus is a virus. It attacks whomever happens to be in its path, and that has nothing to do with issues of justice. So what, right off the bat, the narrative that is being spun here is the same narrative that the mainstream media and the Democratic Party and the far left liberals want to convince the people of this country that it's systemically racist and everything about our system, our democracy, our economic system, our social order is systemic. So obviously, if Black people, Hispanic people, Asian people, minorities of any type are hurt by COVID-19, it must be, by definition, because of racism, because that's the only answer that the mainstream media and the Democratic Party wants to push right now. They're trying to convince everyone that this country is systemically racist, it's systemically white supremacist, and it was built that way from the beginning. The so-called 1619 Project, that's the whole message. The message of the 1619 Project is that no, we shouldn't celebrate 1776 as the founding of our nation. We should go back to the very time where the first slaves came over from Africa, which is 1619, and that's the real start of our country, and that explains everything in our country, racism and white supremacy. And they want to make this country from stem to stern into a systemically evil place to be. And that's why they want to revolutionize and tear down all of not just statues of famous people in our history, but also the institutions of our history. And we're seeing that happening even at the highest levels of government right now, where you see the Democrats, the far left liberals, wanting to actually do away with, for example, the number of justices on the Supreme Court. It's been there over 100 years. They want to stack the court. In other words, to get power, to revolutionize society, to basically overturn the United States into some other kind of government system or economic system that they feel is more just. They want to overturn our institutions to make that happen, and they're willing to do that. They're willing to overturn our institutions to get their way. So that's what we've heard over the last 6-7 months, and that's what we now hear from the president of Wheaton College. Let me read it again. The burdens of the pandemic fall disproportionately hard, only one of many injustices during a year when we have also witnessed appalling violence against people of color. Now, what does that represent? Well, because of the death of George Floyd, which is automatically assumed, although not proven, that it is at the hands of a white supremacist racist. Now, the facts around the George Floyd problem and situation are sad, because here was a man being arrested and he died shortly after he was arrested. And there was a video that was taken of him being arrested, and it showed the white officer with his knee on the neck of George Floyd. Now, that is not in and of itself something unusual, because police officers are trained in their police training to subdue people who they're arresting, and sometimes the training would go over techniques of restraint. And one of the techniques of restraint is to put a knee on the back of the neck, because it holds the person down if they're having a difficulty restraining the person. Of course, there are all kinds of other methods that are used by the police, but in this instance, the policeman was using a method that was a standard method that was used all over the country for policemen to restrain people they are arresting. So there's nothing racist, particularly about the method of restraint in the George Floyd case. It's also not unusual that people who are being arrested in the course of their arrest die. Now, it is rare that a person would die because most of the police, when they arrest someone, there is not an incident where the person either has a heart attack or has a stroke or whatever George Floyd had. We're still not exactly sure what the cause of death was, but from the autopsies and from the investigations, at least one of the autopsies concluded that it was not due to the neck restraint of the police officer. So George Floyd had drugs in his system. He had COVID-19 in his system. He was, for example, high on a drug that can actually trigger that kind of manic response to stimuli. So George Floyd had a lot of problems going into that arrest, and unfortunately he died at the hands of these officers who were arresting him. But just the fact that George Floyd was black and the officer was white does not mean that this is a death as a result of racism, or that the police department is systemically racist, or that the police are disproportionately picking on people of color to arrest and hassle and brutalize. Now, there is the question here that is raised by the article of the president of Wheaton College. He talks about, we've also witnessed appalling violence against people of color. Well, it isn't, again, a fact that this officer did anything violent against George Floyd. It may or may not be a case of police brutality. He wasn't beating George Floyd. He wasn't pummeling George Floyd. He wasn't taking his gun and beating him over the head, pistol whipping George Floyd. He was using a technique of restraint that is recognized by police departments and law enforcement officers all over the country, and is trained in the academies as a use of restraint. So just for the fact that the officer had his knee on George Floyd's neck doesn't mean that he was racist or even that he was brutalizing him. Now, it may come out in a court hearing, which we hope that this is investigated thoroughly, and if the officer is guilty of police brutality, if he did use excessive force against George Floyd, that we hope that this officer would be locked up and that justice would be served. But there isn't anything on the video that was shown that sparked these riots and protests and sparked this whole 6-7 months of so-called racial justice marching and protesting. There's nothing on the video that shows that this man is a racist. So we don't know if he would put his knee on the neck of a white man, a Hispanic, Asian. We don't know any of that is involved at all. And yet the assumption on the rioters and the protesters and the marchers and the looters in the name of George Floyd, the assumption is that this was a racist cop, a white supremacist who was brutalizing a helpless black man, which was not the case. This man, George Floyd, was resisting arrest. He refused to get into the backseat of the officer's car. He had to be restrained. There was a whole complicated situation there. But again, the looters, the protesters, the people burning buildings and burning down restaurants, and actually now there are deaths and murders and assassinations as a result of this on the part of protesters. Now all of this whole big mess is just assumed, I guess, by the president of Wheaton College, that we're assuming here, according to his article, that people of color are having violence against them. And there's no evidence of that whatsoever. If you look at the statistics and the information concerning crimes by people in this country. Black people, minorities are not being targeted by the police. There is no evidence of systemic racism in the police department. There is probably, and we should assume that everywhere there is some form of racism because it's a sin. And as Christians, we understand that we have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Just as we should assume that there is greed in all areas of society, there is envy in all areas of society, there is revenge, there is jealousy, there is hatred for someone for all kinds of reasons. There are all kinds of sins that people commit and think internally. And to say that the police department is systemically racist, there is no evidence of that. To say that the police department is systemically a white supremacist organization, there's no evidence for that. Today, there isn't. The past in our country has had blatant racism. There was once in our country slavery 150 years ago. There's no question. Everybody understands that. We fought a war to correct that. That war was fought. Slavery was abolished. And then there was the problem of the whole Jim Crow era, where there were separate facilities, for example, in the South before the civil rights legislation in the 60s, where there was a separate bathroom, there was separate drinking fountains, separate schools for blacks, and this was illegal now. And 50, 60 years later, we cannot look at this country as if we are back in the Jim Crow era. It's not true. It's a false narrative. And so the president of Wheaton College, I guess, is just going to say, well, we're going to just buy into the whole woke narrative because that's what everybody else is doing, so we're going to do it as well. So it gets worse, though, if you move on to the next page in the Wheaton magazine. You have what is said, a message to campus from Wheaton's senior administrative cabinet. And this is a letter from President Reichen's senior administrative cabinet. It says, editor's note, on June 1st, the senior administrative cabinet sent the following message to the campus community following the violence that claimed the lives of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd. The message was published on Wheaton's website, social media channels, and is printed here in full. So again, here we go. We're buying right into the leftist media's narrative by naming these three names, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd. All of these situations have a context, and all of these situations are not as simple as white man racist, white man bad, killing black man innocent. No, it's not that way. Even though the protesters, the rioters, the looters, the marchers, the woke leftists, social justice crowd want you to believe that it's just a simple fact that white people are killing black people in the streets and it has to be stopped. No, it isn't anything like that. These are all people who are involved in situations. For example, Breonna Taylor, her boyfriend was a drug dealer. She was photographed participating in the process of the drug dealing. She would go and actually was involved, not directly involved, but indirectly involved in the drug sales, illegal drug sales. And so police officers came to her apartment at night, had a warrant with her name on it and her boyfriend, and they knocked on the door, and her boyfriend had a gun, and the police officers had a search warrant to enter the home, so they knocked on the door, no answer, so they broke the door open, and then the boyfriend shot at the police officers shot back, and in the process, she was killed. That isn't white people hunting black people down. So to have this whole narrative spun the way the mainstream media and the Democratic leftists are doing, and then having Wheaton College, a Christian college that's supposed to be teaching the truth and teaching truth matters, to being so careless and sloppy and just lumping it all together and saying, well, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, CNN, they must be telling us the truth because everybody's saying it is. They're assuming that this is a cut and dry case of racism, white privilege, whatever the media is pumping these days is totally false. And it's really sad to see a once great Christian college capitulating so badly to the culture, to the worldly culture, just buying into the assumptions of the worldly culture. Here's what the article says in its lead up. It says, to the members of our community belonging to the African diaspora, please know that you have our love and support and concern. We pray for God's grace and protection on you and your families during this difficult time in our nation's history. Now, what is that all about? Well, they're buying into and assuming again that this time in history is a particularly hard and difficult time for members of the black community. Now, why would they assume that? Because every day on the television, the news reporters and the magazine and television commentators are telling people that black people are under assault by white supremacist racists. And you have, for example, the popular basketball player LeBron James saying that black people are afraid to go out of their house because white people are hunting them down, which is absurd. It's totally absurd. There's a movement now to defund the police, and in many communities that is actually happening because the assumption is that policemen, bad, white, supremacist, racist, and they're hunting black people down, which is totally false. It's a lie. It doesn't exist that way at all. And yet, Wheaton College, in the midst of all of this, you would think that maybe an institution that's supposed to have the best Christian thinkers and best scholars and best minds and sharpest minds and are able to get to the heart of the problems. No, they simply buy into the whole mainstream media propaganda machinery and just swallow the whole thing hook, line, and sinker. To the members of our community belonging to the African diaspora, please know that you have our love, support, and concern. We pray for God's grace and protection on you. Now, why would this community be singled out by this cabinet, administrative cabinet, for protection during this difficult time in our nation's history? Why are they the ones that need special protection? What about Hispanics? What about white people? What about Asians? What about all the different ethnic and diverse races in this country? Why would that community, the black community, be singled out for special prayers and protection during this difficult time in our nation's history? Because the narrative is telling us from television and from the liberal leftist administrations of colleges and the popular culture that black people are threatened by white people, and it's a dangerous situation to be black in the United States. When contrary to that, it is the best time to be black in the United States. We have less racism, less violence against black people, more opportunities. The unemployment rate in the black community was the lowest ever before this pandemic hit. So it has actually shown in the real world, the statistics, the numbers, the real concrete measurements that black people are better off today, where we are right now in society, than ever before in the history of this nation. And yet, Wheaton College Senior Administrative Cabinet are praying especially for the members of the black community at Wheaton College for their protection during this difficult time in our nation's history, and being all dramatic about things, which is totally a bogus narrative. And they should know that, and they should correct that, and they should have some message to members of our community at Wheaton College and say, students and faculty and administration and everyone involved in Wheaton College community, we're praying for our nation during this time. We're praying that there would be truth and that there would be justice and that people would not jump to conclusions and to listen to false narratives, and that the truth would rise to the top and you would not be fooled by the propaganda machinery that's out in society telling us false narratives. That's what the prayer should be. But instead, they buy into the false narratives about white supremacists, racism, systemic racism. And the reason we already knew that Wheaton College was already buying into the narrative that America is a systematically racist country, because right on the Wheaton College website, there is a book represented by an author, Professor Kendi, and that book is recommended to the Wheaton College community. It's called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And this man goes through and basically tells you if you're white, you're racist, whether you know it or not, and you're guilty of racism and white supremacy and white privilege, and whether you know it or not, you're guilty. You need to repent. You need to ask forgiveness for the black people in our country, and you need to listen to them and not say anything, not object, and not say you're not guilty because you are guilty, and shame on you, white people, and everything. That is on the Wheaton College website as recommended reading for the Wheaton community. So we already knew that this was going through. There's an Office of Intercultural Engagement. There is an Office of Multicultural Development, basically a diversity department. And so we knew that this was all coming down the pipe, but we didn't realize how, to the extent it was. So sadly enough, Wheaton College has displayed almost a total wokeness, if you want to put it that way. And we need to pray for Wheaton College. I will get into the article here by the administrative cabinet next time because it's too long to read in this segment. But pray for Wheaton College. Pray that they get some sanity into their thinking so that they can teach students the truth. God bless. See you back next week on another edition of Christian Answers.